In the summer of 421, before the birth of Christ, a woman named Umelia stood among the ruins of her home in the city of Mantinea, watching as Spartan soldiers systematically separated the surviving population into groups. Umelia was 26 years old, the wife of a hoplite warrior named Cleomenes, who had died 3 days earlier defending the city walls during the final Spartan assault. She had 3 children, 2 daughters aged 7 and 5, and a son aged 3. For 3 days, she had hidden with her children in the cellar of her house, while the battle raged above, listening to the sounds of combat, the screams of the dying, the eventual silence that meant the city had fallen. Now Spartan officers moved through the ruins, organizing the survivors. The men who had surrendered, those few who remained alive, were being marched away in chains. The elderly and very young children were being gathered separately, and the women of childbearing age, women like Umelia, were being assembled into another group, examined by Spartan commanders who walked among them, assessing them like one might assess livestock at a market. Umelia held her children close, trying to make herself invisible, hoping that perhaps she and her family would be overlooked, that they might somehow escape whatever fate the Spartans had planned. But a Spartan officer approached her, looked at her appraisingly, and asked her age, and whether the children with her were hers. When she answered, he nodded, and made a mark on a wax tablet he carried, then moved on to the next woman without explanation. That evening, Umelia and approximately 200 other women from Mantinea were separated from their children and marched out of the city under Spartan guard. The women's screams and pleas as they were torn from their children echoed through the ruins. Umelia's 3-year-old son cried out for her, trying to run after her, held back by an elderly woman who had been designated to care for the children left behind. Umelia looked back, trying to memorize her children's faces, having no idea if she would ever see them again. Feeling something inside her break as the distance between them grew, the women were marched for 3 days, given minimal food and water, sleeping on the ground at night under guard, moving steadily towards Sparta. Many of them had never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. None of them knew what awaited them when they reached the Spartan homeland. But they had heard stories, whispered tales of what happened to captured women, stories that made death seem preferable to survival. What happened to Umelia and the other women of Mantinea over the months and years that followed would exemplify the Spartan approach to conquest, an approach that understood that destroying an enemy meant not just killing their men, but systematically targeting their women, erasing their culture, absorbing their bloodlines, and creating a living reminder that resistance to Sparta was worse than futile. It was catastrophic, not just for those who died, but for those who survived. But before I tell you what happened to Umelia, before I reveal the specific fates that awaited captured women in Sparta, before I explain why ancient sources describe this treatment as worse than death, I need to tell you about Sparta itself, about how this unique Greek city-state organized its entire society around warfare and conquest, and about how the treatment of defeated enemies' wives became a crucial part of maintaining Spartan power and identity. This is the story of what Spartans did to the wives of defeated warriors, why these practices were considered fates, worse than death, even in an ancient world accustomed to brutality, and how Sparta's systematic targeting of women served strategic purposes that went far beyond the battlefield. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I describe is documented in ancient sources. Plutarch, Xenophon, Herodotus, Thucydides, historians who wrote about Spartan practices based on their own observations or accounts from people who had experienced or witnessed these events. If you want to understand how conquest has targeted women throughout history, how systematic practices of forced reproduction and identity erasure have functioned as weapons of war, how societies can normalize atrocities by framing them as strategic necessities, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you understand ancient warfare and how women have been systematically targeted throughout military history. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you know about Sparta. Now, let me tell you about the Spartan system, because to understand what happened to women like Umelia, you need to understand how Sparta organized its entire society around the production of warriors and the maintenance of military supremacy. Sparta was unique among Greek city-states. While Athens developed democracy and philosophy and art, while other Greek cities built monuments and pursued trade and created cultural achievements, Sparta dedicated itself entirely to warfare. Every aspect of Spartan society was organized around creating the most effective warriors possible and maintaining military dominance over both neighboring Greek states and over the massive population of enslaved people called Helots, who worked Spartan lands and allowed Spartan citizens to focus entirely on military training. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised by the state in a brutal training system called the aug. They learned to fight, to endure pain, to obey orders without question, to value the state above all else, including their own lives and families. They lived in communal barracks, ate together, trained together, fought together. Individual identity was suppressed in favor of collective identity as Spartans. Weakness was not tolerated. Infants judged too weak or deformed were reportedly exposed and left to die. The society was organized entirely around producing warriors who would fight effectively as a unit and who would never retreat or surrender regardless of circumstances. Spartan men were warriors first and everything else second. They did not work the land that was done by helots. They did not engage in trade or crafts. Those were beneath them or handled by a class of non-citizens called periokoi. They existed to fight, and they were extraordinarily good at it. For centuries, Sparta fielded the most feared military force in the Greek world, an army of professional warriors who had trained for combat their entire lives. But maintaining this system required certain elements that shaped Spartan ideology and practice. First, Sparta needed a large population of enslaved helots to work the land and support the warrior class. The helots vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens, perhaps 10 helots for every Spartan, creating a constant fear of helot rebellion that influenced how Sparta treated both helots and defeated enemies. Second, Sparta needed to maintain its citizen population by producing enough children to replace warriors who died in battle. And third, Sparta needed to ensure that defeated enemies could never rise again to threaten Spartan power. These requirements led Sparta to develop systematic practices for dealing with conquered populations, particularly with the women of defeated enemies. And these practices went far beyond simple enslavement or killing. They involved deliberate targeting of women for purposes that combined pragmatic strategy with psychological warfare, reproductive control with cultural destruction. Let me tell you about the first principle of Sparta's approach to captured women. The understanding that women were the key to destroying an enemy permanently. Killing the men of a defeated city removed one generation of warriors, but the women would bear the next generation, and if allowed to maintain their cultural identity and pass it on to their children, they could create a new generation of enemies. So Sparta developed methods to prevent this, methods that involved controlling women's reproduction, erasing their cultural identity, and absorbing them into Spartan society in ways that ensured their children would serve Sparta rather than seeking revenge for their defeated fathers. When Sparta conquered a city or defeated an enemy in battle, the treatment of surviving populations followed certain patterns that were refined over centuries of conquest. The male warriors would typically be killed either in battle or after surrender. Male civilians of military age might also be executed or enslaved, depending on how fiercely the city had resisted. Elderly people and very young children were sometimes allowed to remain in the conquered territory under Spartan oversight, or they might be relocated or enslaved, depending on circumstances. But women of childbearing age, roughly ages 15 to 40, received special attention because they represented both a threat and an opportunity. These women would be gathered and assessed by Spartan commanders. The assessment considered several factors: their age and apparent health, their social status in the conquered city, whether they had valuable skills, and whether they had children. Based on this assessment, the women would be divided into groups, each destined for different fates within the Spartan system. Some would become helots, added to the massive enslaved population that worked Spartan land. These women would labor in fields and in Spartan households, their children born into helot status, their lives defined by endless work under brutal conditions with no hope of freedom. But enslavement, as terrible as it was in some ways the least horrifying fate that awaited captured women, because at least helot women retained some connection to their own cultural identity and to each other. Other women faced fates that ancient sources describe in terms that suggest they were considered worse than death, worse than slavery, worse than any physical torture. These were fates that involved the complete erasure of identity, forced reproduction under circumstances that destroyed the women psychologically, and the creation of children who would grow up as Spartans, serving the very system that had destroyed their mothers' original families and cities. Let me tell you about the systematic forced marriage practices that Sparta employed with captured noble women, because these practices reveal the sophisticated cruelty of Spartan conquest strategy. When a city was conquered, the wives and daughters of the enemy's ruling class, the women who had been the most prominent in the defeated society, were specifically identified and set aside. These women had value to Sparta not as laborers, but as symbols of the defeated enemy's total subjugation, and as vessels for producing children who would have mixed heritage, but Spartan identity. These noble women would be assigned as wives or concubines to Spartan citizens, particularly to Spartan men who were older and had not yet produced children, or who had lost wives and needed to produce more offspring to maintain the citizen population. The assignments were made by Spartan authorities, not by the women or even necessarily by the Spartan men receiving them. This was state policy designed to serve state interests. The forced marriages served multiple purposes. First, they humiliated the defeated enemy by demonstrating that even their highest-ranking women, the wives and daughters of their leaders, were now property to be distributed to Spartans. Second, they produced children who would be raised as Spartans, but who carried the blood of the conquered people, creating a visible demonstration that the conquered population had been absorbed into Sparta. Third, they prevented these women from bearing children who might grow up as members of the defeated culture with grievances against Sparta. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, describe how these forced marriages were sometimes conducted as public ceremonies, rituals designed to demonstrate Sparta's total victory. The captured woman would be dressed in wedding garments and brought before the Spartan community. She would be formally married to her assigned Spartan husband in a ceremony that mimicked traditional Greek wedding rituals, but that everyone understood was actually a display of conquest and subjugation. The woman would be forced to participate in the ceremony, to speak the required words, to go through the motions of a willing bride, while everyone present knew she was a captive, whose former husband had likely been killed by Spartans days or weeks earlier. After the ceremony, the woman would be taken to her new husband's household. There she would be expected to fulfill all the duties of a Spartan wife, managing the household, bearing children, raising those children as Spartans. But she would always be marked as a captive, as an outsider, as someone whose presence in the household was a reminder of Spartan conquest. The children she bore would be considered Spartan citizens if the father was a Spartan citizen, but they would carry the knowledge of their mother's origin, would grow up hearing or not hearing, which was perhaps worse about the city their mother came from and the family she had lost. For the captured woman, this fate was described by contemporary sources as worse than death.